is a very interesting person in this field. You can see, he is the current head of the Inayati-Maimuni lineage of Sufism. He studied history of religions at Michigan State University and contemplative religion at Naropa Institute before pursuing traditional studies in both Sufism and Hasidism with Zalman's, what is his, you pronounce that? Zalman Shastar, Shalomi, and various other teachers. So it is a very interesting combination, a Hasidic teacher and a teacher in the lineage of Inayat Khan, so Hazrat Inayat Khan. It is, he is, and then he has studied Vedanta, various different other religious streams, and in fact, this morning he was giving here a workshop on 8 limbs of Sufi yoga. Of course, he could, it was very beautifully presented. Those who were here, they must have felt that how a deep subject was being presented with ease as well as, understandable to everyone who was listening. So I requested him to come and he agreed readily. But there was a little glitch. Somehow by the grace of God that got solved. So he said, well, he has some other things have cropped up, so he will not be able to come. But then things arranged themselves in such a way that we have him here today. So another example of, self-effort and grace. So, so I request Netanel to present his thoughts.
I was sitting here earlier, very early on, while Reverend Trudy Jimpu was speaking, and I found myself not wanting to hear myself speak. I only wanted to go on hearing her. There are some things that make universal fellowship easy. And joy in one another's company, and joy in the companionship of people that are on the path with you, fellow travelers, and the road looks different for them in many ways. They're looking through their eyes and they're seeing from their perspective here and here beside you. But you're walking the same path, and there's a great joy in it. And I only wanted to listen to her. So now I've got a problem. I don't want to hear myself speak, and so I may not listen. As I was thinking about grace and self-effort from the Jewish perspective, I thought Judaism doesn't really talk about it. Not really, not about. It doesn't use the language of grace so much, or effort. Judaism, like Islam, tends to think in terms of what you must do. And it certainly implores mercy from God and asks that mercy, that grace be available, but continues to emphasize action. And as I thought about it, I felt that the idea of grace and effort, the relationship between the two involves a mystery, and not one that I think I'm capable of solving. But, as often happens, a story occurred to me. It's a story from the Hasidic tradition, a mashal, really. A mashal is a parable. And it's a parable that's told by one of the great storytellers of the Hasidic tradition, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Told by other masters also, and curiously, the same story exists in the Sufi tradition. And it's probably earlier in Sufism than it is in Hasidism. And it shows the kind of cross-fertilization that exists between traditions, because the Hasidic masters of Eastern Europe were often making the journey to the Holy Land. And in order to make that journey, they had to pass through Istanbul. And they clearly picked up stories, and Rabbi Nachman among them. And so the same story exists in various Sufi texts. But when it comes to Rabbi Nachman, it sounds very Jewish. And it goes like this. Once in a little shtetl, a little village in Eastern Europe, where the Jews were within a small village of non-Jews, there would be an even smaller village called a shtetl of Jews. And in such a poor village lived a very poor man named Yankel, which is a way of talking about somebody named Yaakov, Jacob. And Yankel or Yankele lived in this poor shtetl, and the poorest man in the shtetl, with the poorest house, a shack, a hovel really. And in his little shack there was a door, but the door was hanging off the hinges. A empty room that he has, that is his one room, and he lives in this little shack, this hovel with the door hanging off the hinges. And in his little shack, at night, he has a dream. And in the dream, this poor little Jew in the shtetl in the middle of the Ukraine dreams of Vienna. 1,000 miles away, Vienna, Austria, and he dreams of a fabulous bridge that is outside the royal palace. And in the dream, he can see every detail of the bridge and the palace and the whole surroundings, and he can see himself approaching it, and he can see that if he goes under the bridge, he'll find a treasure. If he digs in a certain spot, he'll find a treasure. And he wakes in the morning and he thinks, well, it's not so unexpected that a very poor man should have such a dream of going to a fabulous city of wealth and finding a great treasure. But then he has the dream again. And again, and again, and again, for weeks, the same dream, in the same detail, in the same order. And you have the same dream for weeks on end, and you start to think maybe there's something to it. And the thought to this poor man becomes almost maddening. And so he thinks, what do I have to lose? Maybe I should do something about it. So, like in the old cartoons, he takes a cloth, he puts his little belongings in it, puts a loaf of bread in there, and ties it to the end of a stick and throws it over his shoulders and begins to walk. From his little town, Bratslav, in the Ukraine, it is a 2 weeks journey, 1,000 miles to Vienna. And so he walks, and he can't afford a ride. Every once in a while, somebody comes by with a hay cart and allows him to hop on. 2 weeks, it's a lot of walking, a lot of riding in a hay cart, a lot of sleeping on the ground under bushes, in barns where he can steal in secretly. And after 2 weeks' long journey this way, he comes to Vienna. And indeed, he sees the bridge exactly as he'd seen it in the dream, a bridge that he had had no access to knowing what that bridge would look like in real life, whether such a bridge would actually exist, but he'd seen it in his dream, and it looks exactly the same. And in the distance beyond the bridge is indeed the royal palace. Now he knows, under that bridge he will find the treasure. How could he have known about such a bridge, such a palace? So he begins to run. He's running, the thirst is upon him now. Now he will have his riches and he will be a rich man. And he runs and runs at breakneck speed until he sees something he had not seen in his dream, and he stops dead in his tracks and almost falls over. 2 sentries at the corners of the bridge. The royal guard. And now he doesn't know what to do. 2 large, intimidating men. And he, an old man, poverty-stricken, a Jew, born to misery in the Ukraine and not much better in Vienna. The royal guards are not going to treat him well. There's no history of this. So he does what you would expect. He starts to fret and stand there and look nervously and slyly toward the bridge and pace back and forth. And he goes on doing this for about an hour until he hears a shout. "Hey, Jew, what are you doing?" It's the guards. "Get over here." Finally, he comes over, head bowed. Can't resist the order of the guards. They say, "What are you doing? You've been standing there for an hour like an idiot. Do you have some notion of begging from the royal family when they cross the bridge? If you do, it's time to head on." And already having him by the shoulders and asking him what he's doing, he's terrified and shaking, and in his panic, he begins to do the only thing he can think of: tell them the truth. And so he begins to sputter out the story of the dream. He had the dream 2 months ago, and then it again and again and again, and under the bridge there must be this treasure. And if only they'll let him dig there, he would share at least half, more than half, all of it. You can have almost all of it. Leave me a little something to get back, Panicked, sweating. And then one of the guards staring at him sternly. He knows he's about to get a whack. And unexpectedly, the guard laughs. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. What an idiot. What are you doing following your dreams? If I followed my dreams, what would happen? Last night, I had a dream that, listen to this, I had a dream that I made the 2-week, 1,000-mile journey to some nowhere town in the Ukraine called Bratslav or something, and in a shack, in which some old Jew must have lived, in a shack, a hovel really, with a door hanging off the hinges. And inside the shack I go, and behind a little stove in the back there is a loose floorboard, and I pull up this floorboard and there is a treasure. How likely am I to find a treasure in the middle of a shack in the Ukraine? This is what comes from listening to your dreams. Look at you. You're 2 weeks on the road. Oh, what an idiot. Yankel says, "Thank you very much. It was very nice to meet you. Please, you may go on now." And sets out on the road. And again, long 2-week journey, on foot, getting a ride when he can, sleeping under bushes, sleeping in a barn when he can. And he arrives home and runs to the door and swings it open. The door flies off and finally falls on the ground. Goes to the back. He knows about the floorboard. It's been loose for years, but why would he look under it? Rats. What do you expect to find under it? He pulls the floorboard up, and indeed, a treasure. And as Rabbi Nachman, the great storyteller, would say, sometimes you have to go very far in order to find what you always had, what was very near to you. This is the curious mystery about being human. This curious phenomena that always we cannot seem to be able to see what we already have, and often can only see it reflected in someone else's eyes, or need to be told what is perfectly obvious to someone else about ourselves. Can we get there without seeing it reflected? Can we get there without taking the long journey? Some people say we can. We've seen very little evidence of it. I was having a conversation with a great teacher whom many of you may have heard, Father Thomas Keating, the founder of the Centering Prayer Movement, a wonderful person and a great monk and great scholar and deep human being. And he was telling me about certain teachers who were coming to him and who were saying that all you need to do is yield to presence. The divine presence is there, waiting, and you need to only lay back into it and soak. All this efforting is to no avail and no account. We're making it too hard on ourselves. And he was really holding this question because he really is a wise man, and he was really thinking about it. And he says, but you know, Netanel, I don't know how I could have gotten there without the dark nights, without the pain of the journey. I didn't have the eyes to see. The thing that I'm being told is perfectly obvious, that is right there, always available, and indeed I believe it is. I believe God's grace is always there, perfectly available, and perfectly obvious, except to me. And maybe because it is supposed to be so obvious, that it is so ordinary, that it is just so ordinary that we are inured to it and have no eyes to see it. And so we have this difficulty of having to learn to see what is perfectly obvious. Is my time up? I heard it. You know, you can't just plant in any ground. You know, any gardener knows that you have to cultivate the soil. I wanted to plant in the backyard where I had a new house, and I wanted to plant a garden and grow things. And I went out to the backyard and discovered that I had clay, red clay, this deep. And had to spend hours digging and turning that clay up, and then putting in fertilizer and mixing it in with dry material and leaves from the fall, and turning it over and over and over so that something would grow there. And it was a tremendous effort. You know, unless the earth is cultivated and enriched in a certain way, the seed is not going to grow. And it's hard to escape that. By some miracle, given the right conditions, that seed will grow. And its own growth is miraculous and full of grace. And yet there are causes and conditions that aid it, and we participate in those. We are, you know, as you were saying, you know, the wave is not separate from the ocean. We're the ocean. Our effort is not separate from the grace that is happening. We are agents of grace. And it may look like effort as we think of ourselves as the wave. But in some ways, that's thinking about the whole effort and grace is still thoughts as an individual, as a wave. But as the ocean, we're the agents of grace. And there's only the grace. And as the ocean, we are agents of grace for others, not necessarily thinking about what will be grace for us. But it is our duty, our reality, that we cultivate and seed the planet with our own bodies. That's what we are to the earth. We sink back into it. We fertilize it. Maybe we're not different than the wind or the rain. I was thinking again about how in Judaism we don't tend to think in terms of grace and self-effort, as I was saying, but in the mystical teachings of the Jewish tradition, in the Kabbalah, that which is received, the received tradition, the oral tradition, we do talk about Hesed and Guevara, two divine qualities that exist in a dialectical tension. Chesed being loving kindness, the equivalent of grace, that one of God's great qualities is loving kindness, chesed. Chesed in the Kabbalah is like a big hug. It is the equivalent, if you were to personify it, the equivalent of that person that you know that always wants to hug you and just as equally wants to be hugged all the time. This might be a bear of a man that just wants to hold you and enjoys your hug just as much and is full of this loving kindness, or a mother with a soft love, always available. And that's chesed. But in our world, chesed by itself can be problematic. Sometimes chesed is a little too unbounded. He wants to hug everybody, but not everybody wants to be hugged. And sometimes that person with that kind of ebullient love, that overwhelming desire to give, often gets taken advantage of. You all know that child, or perhaps you were that child, that had so much to give and then got your hand slapped. Or were told that was wrong. And it's that chesed, that loving kindness, that raw chesed or loving kindness is without boundaries. It's its nature. And so the corollary or corrective to it on the other side is Guevara. Guevara literally means strength, but it translates in quality to discipline or boundaries. It's considered a feminine quality to have boundaries, to self-protect, to be aware enough to know that you might get taken advantage of, and to counterbalance chesed. These two qualities are necessary to one another. There's a third quality in the tradition. They form a triad on what some of you may have seen, the tree of life, the Eitz Chaim diagram. So you have chesed, loving kindness, and it's like a parent who, hearing their child cry, wants to give them anything that they want and do. Guevara on the other side says, no, you don't need it. You'll never have it. Stop crying. And then the corrective in the middle that counterbalances the two is a quality that's called tiferet, beauty, which is also compared to rechem, the womb, Rahman in Arabic, compassion. And compassion says, as a parent, I hear you saying what you want. I don't know that you necessarily need that. Hearing your want, I'll give you what you need, not necessarily what you want. So we need the two to exist in this dialectical tension to resolve itself in a third kind of understanding, knowing that they're constantly in collaboration toward a certain end. It reminds me of a little story of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, a mystical movement within Judaism that started in the Ukraine, and his great-grandson was Rabbi Nachman, who told the story, the original story that I told. And he once went to a town to win a convert to Hasidism. The man was already a famous rabbi and a deeply ascetic mystic, a powerful sermoner. And the Baal Shem Tov goes into this man's town and just stops in the town square early in the morning. And as a man passes, he says, he asks directions, and the man stops to give him directions, and the Baal Shem Tov starts a story. Oh, that reminds me. And he begins a story, and pretty soon the man is listening in rapt attention to the Baal Shem Tov's story. And then another man passes by and catches part of the story and is intrigued, and he stays to listen. The story gets bigger, and pretty soon there's a crowd of townspeople listening to the story. And this is early in the morning, and the first person on the way that he passes along the way, that he stops to tell the story, turned out to be the attendant at the synagogue. And the attendant's job at the synagogue was to get there very early to unlock the doors for the very pious rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polanoia, that the Baal Shem Tov has come to convert. And he gets to the synagogue that day, passes a huge crowd. He doesn't know what's going on. He can't see what's at the center of it. Goes on to the synagogue, very angry. What is all this noise and commotion in the morning? Gets to the synagogue, and the door is locked. And now, this ascetic, this pious ascetic, becomes very angry. He's incensed because he cannot do his service to God. And in anger, he goes to find the attendant, breaks through the crowd, pushes people apart, and finds the attendant at the center of the crowd talking to a man that looks like a peasant. He grabs him and shakes him. Why didn't you open the door to the synagogue? I have service to God to do. The man says, I'm so sorry. I got caught up in this story. The stories are amazing. He says, don't tell me about stories. Get and unlock the door. Then he turns to the peasant. What are you doing keeping him from his work? He's got holy work to do, and I have holy work to do. And you've kept all these people from their work with your stories. Come to the synagogue. I want to have a talk with you. He's going to set him straight. So he brings the man to the synagogue and says, what were you doing? And the man says, let me tell you a story. It's the Baal Shem Tov. This is what he does. He's the master of the holy name, the holy word. And he begins to tell him a story about horses and carriages, and he says, what is this? And he says, with a horse and a carriage, if you hold the reins too tight, the horse cannot neigh. And the rabbi was a very learned man and deeply sincere in his holy work, but he realized what the message was. He was holding things too tight And he had no joy in his spiritual life. There was no joy in it anymore because he was holding so tight all the time. Very much as the Buddha was saying, if the strings on the Vienna are too tight, they threaten to break all the time. If too loose, on the other hand, you'll get no note out of it. I don't know what I'm doing with the violin and bow in a Vienna. Just that way. You get no sound out of it. So, wait on grace, maybe there's no sound. Too much effort, the thing breaks. It's inattention. One last story. A famous story that's in the Talmud. There are two great rabbis in the Talmud, and they're often paired as opposites. Hillel, after whom the Hillel organizations that you have in every college town are named, this great compassionate rabbi of the Talmud who represents Hesed, loving kindness. And his counterpart, equally pious, Shammai, who represents Gevura. And one is not thought greater than the other. But they take two different approaches, one of discipline, one of loving kindness, grace. A Greek man, who's thinking of converting, goes to Shammai, who he hears is the great scholar of Torah, of the Bible, and says, I'm thinking of converting. I like your religion. I like what I've seen. I'm a busy man. Perhaps you might tell me the whole of the Torah, the essence of the Torah that you can tell me while I'm standing on one foot. And if you can convey the essence to me while I'm standing on one foot, perhaps I'll be convinced and convert. Shammai looks at the man sternly, looks around, grabs a stick, and whacks him. He says, now go away. And the man runs away, holding himself and his hurt arm and his face bruised, and runs off, and he has no idea what's happened. So he goes to see Hillel, who he hears is a nicer guy. And he does the same thing. Hillel, I'm a Greek, and I'm thinking of converting to Judaism. I like what I've heard so far. Perhaps you convince me, telling me the whole of the Torah or the essence of the Torah that you can tell me while I'm standing on one foot. He's conditioned, right? And Hillel looks at the man, looks at him, and says, that which you would not like done to you, don't do to somebody else. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. And the man goes, equally surprised to when he got hit with a stick. Now, what I like to point out is that he was given the same teaching by both. Shammai was a little more direct. That hurt, did it? Don't do that to someone. Go and learn now. Now, what had happened to him with Shammai and getting whacked by the stick conditioned him to receive the second message. And that's the difficult teaching that we're always faced with in life. The hard journey, the difficulties, condition the heart to receive grace.